The wind was a blade against her skin, a merciless shriek that tore through the thin wool of her cloak and sought the very marrow of her bones. Alara ran, her lungs burning with the fire of exhaustion and the ice of the mountain air. Each step was a plunge into a sea of white, the snowdrifts clutching at her ankles, trying to drag her down into their frozen embrace. Behind her, somewhere in the swirling chaos of the blizzard, were the shouts of men. They were not the sounds of a lawful posse, but the greedy, cruel calls of hunters closing in on their quarry. To them, she was not a person, but a prize, an object of possession to be dragged back to the man who had stolen her name, her freedom, and nearly her life. Her world had collapsed into this singular, desperate flight, a brutal symphony of howling wind and the frantic, panicked drumming of her own heart. The life she had known, a quiet world of books and teaching, of gentle order and moral certainty, had been a house of glass shattered by the stone of one man's entitlement. Baron Croft. The name was a poison on her tongue, a brand of terror in her mind. He had wanted her, and when she had refused him, he had decided that if he could not have her heart, he would own her fear. He had framed her, turning her from a respectable governess into a hunted fugitive, his lies spreading like a winter plague through the territory. Now there was only the snow, the cold, and the closing dark. Hope was a dying ember, and the vast, indifferent wilderness felt like a tomb waiting to accept her. But as her strength failed and her vision began to blur into a single, overwhelming expanse of white, a flicker of defiance, as stubborn as a lone candle in a gale, refused to be extinguished. She would not let the end of her story be written by him. She would not become a ghost in his victory. She would keep moving, one agonizing step at a time, until the mountains claimed her or a miracle delivered her. And as she stumbled onward, a faint, impossible light blinked through the curtain of snow, a distant, golden star in a universe of white despair. Have you ever felt a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical wall, separating you from the rest of the world? A solitude built not of choice, but of pain, a fortress to keep a broken heart from shattering completely? This is a story about two such solitudes, two souls adrift in the harsh wilderness of the American West, one fleeing a tyrant and the other haunted by ghosts. It is a story of how sometimes the most impenetrable walls can be breached by the quietest acts of courage and compassion. It is the story of Silas and Alara, and it begins, as so many stories of great change do, in the heart of a storm. The light Alara had seen was a lantern, hung from the porch of a small, solitary cabin nestled in a protective embrace of ancient pines. It was a bastion of warmth in a world that had gone cold. Her last ounce of strength carried her to the rough-hewn wooden steps before her legs gave way, and she collapsed into the snow, the darkness finally rushing in to claim her. The heavy cabin door creaked open, spilling a rectangle of warm, golden light onto the snow where she lay. A figure stood silhouetted against it, a man as broad and solid as the mountains themselves. He was a phantom of the frontier, his face obscured by shadow and a thick, untamed beard. For a long moment, he simply looked down at the crumpled form at his feet, his expression unreadable. The wind howled around him, plucking at his worn coat, but he seemed as unmoved by it as a granite cliff. This was Silas, a man who had made a covenant with silence and isolation, a former ranger whose past was a landscape of ashes and sorrow. He had long ago decided the world of men held nothing for him but pain. And yet, he could not leave her. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 100 winters, he knelt, his movements careful and deliberate. He gently turned her over, brushing the snow from a face pale as porcelain and streaked with frozen tears. He saw not an outlaw, not a threat, but a desperation that echoed his own. He gathered her into his arms, surprised at how little she weighed, and carried her across the threshold, away from the storm's fury and into the quiet fortress of his grief. Alara awoke to the gentle crackle of a fire and the scent of pine smoke and brewing coffee. For a disoriented moment, she believed she was in heaven, or perhaps a dream from which she would wake to the familiar nightmare of her flight. But the warmth against her skin was real, the rough wool of the blanket a solid presence. She opened her eyes to a room built of sturdy logs, sparse and masculine, yet meticulously clean. A fire blazed in a stone hearth, its flames dancing with a life that felt defiant in the face of the blizzard still raging against the single window pane. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She was in a stranger's home, a man's home, and her experience had taught her that such situations were fraught with a peril of their own. She sat up, her heart hammering against her ribs, and saw him. He was sitting at a small wooden table, his back to her, cleaning a rifle with slow, practiced movements. He was a large man, his shoulders filling out his flannel shirt, his presence dominating the small space without any overt effort. He did not seem to have noticed she was awake, and the silence stretched, thick with her fear and his impenetrable stillness. He had saved her, yes, but what would he demand in return? The world was a place of transactions, and she had nothing left to give. When he finally turned, his eyes met hers. They were the color of a winter sky, gray and clouded, holding a deep, ancient sadness. There was no menace in them, but no welcome either. There was only a profound weariness, as if he looked upon the world and was perpetually tired by what he saw. He gestured with his chin towards a mug on the hearth. "Drink," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. "It'll warm you." He offered no other words, no questions about who she was, or why she had appeared on his doorstep like a ghost delivered by the storm. This unnerved her more than aggression would have. He was a closed book, a man who lived so deep inside himself that the outside world was merely a distant noise. In those first days, they existed in a shared silence, two planets orbiting the same small sun of the hearth, but never touching. She watched him, cataloging the quiet efficiency of his life. He chopped wood with a powerful rhythm, tended to the fire, and moved through his cabin with the familiarity of a man who knew every creak and groan of its timbers. He was a creature of routine, and she an unexpected disruption. She was the flaw in his solitude, a testament to the world he had tried so desperately to leave behind. He saw her too, saw the fine-boned delicacy that spoke of a different life, the tremor in her hands she tried so hard to conceal, and the unwavering virtue in her gaze. She was a bird with a broken wing, and against every instinct he had cultivated for years, he felt a stirring of something he had long thought buried, the urge to protect. The blizzard did not relent. It held the high country in its icy fist for a week, then another, cocooning the small cabin in a world of white. The forced proximity became a crucible, melting the initial frost of fear and mistrust into something new and uncertain. The silence between them began to change. It was no longer the tense, watchful quiet of strangers, but a more comfortable stillness, punctuated by the shared rhythms of survival. Alara, unable to bear the weight of her own helplessness, began to assert her presence in small, gentle ways. She took the mending of his worn shirt into her own hands, her stitches neat and precise, a quiet rebellion of order against the chaos of their situation. She learned the particular way he liked his coffee, strong and black, and would have a mug waiting for him when he came in from his morning ritual of checking the perimeter of his domain. She did not speak much, for she knew he was a man who valued silence, but her actions spoke for her. They said, "I am not a burden. I am here." In return, Silas began to let her in, not with words, but with actions of his own. He showed her how to properly bank the fire at night, so that the embers would glow until morning. He taught her to distinguish the call of a mountain jay from the cry of a hawk, to read the patterns of the snow as it drifted against the cabin. These were the lessons of his world, the language of the wilderness, and in sharing them, he was sharing a piece of himself. One evening, as the storm outside seemed to gather its strength for a final assault, they sat at the table, a simple meal of salted venison and dried beans between them. The warmth of the fire cast flickering shadows on the log walls, making the small space feel like the only safe harbor in the world. Alara looked at this stoic, guarded man who had asked for nothing, who had offered her shelter without condition. The question that had been burning inside her finally broke free. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why are you helping me?" Silas stopped eating, his gaze fixed on the plate before him. He was silent for so long she thought he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his eyes lifted to meet hers, and for the first time, the clouds in them parted, revealing a glimpse of the man beneath the grief. "Because no one," he said, his voice thick with a pain that was clearly not just for her, "deserves to die in the storm." In that moment, the foundation of their relationship shifted. It was no longer about a rescuer and a victim. It was about two survivors recognizing the wreckage in each other's souls. The narrator of their shared story was no longer fear, but a fragile, emerging trust. He was beginning to see her not as a disruption to his solitude, but as a quiet light within it. And she was beginning to see the fortress he had built around his heart not as a wall to keep her out, but as a ruin he was afraid to leave. When the world finally reappeared from beneath its blanket of white, it was stark and beautiful, the sky a piercing, brilliant blue. The end of the storm meant survival, but it also meant a return to the realities that waited beyond their isolated sanctuary. Silas knew his supplies were dwindling. The journey to the settlement of Redemption, a rough-and-tumble outpost a day's ride away, was now a necessity. A new kind of tension settled in the cabin, the anxiety of impending separation. He found himself strangely reluctant to leave her alone. The thought of the cabin being empty again, of the silence returning to its former, heavier state, was a feeling he had not anticipated. It was an unwelcome crack in the armor of his self-imposed isolation. Before he left, he stood at the door, his jaw tight. "Don't open this for anyone," he commanded, his tone gruffer than he intended. "Keep a log on the fire. I'll be back by sundown tomorrow." It was the most he had said at once in years, and it was a poorly disguised admission of his concern. He rode out, the crunch of his horse's hooves on the crisp snow the only sound in the vast, silent landscape. Redemption was as he remembered it, a muddy street lined with a handful of false-fronted buildings, a place where men came to lose their money, their morals, or their loneliness. As he bartered for flour, salt, and coffee, he kept his head down, avoiding the curious glances his long absence had earned him. But as he was leaving the general store, his eyes caught a piece of paper nailed to a post outside the sheriff's office. It was a wanted poster, the ink slightly blurred by the damp. His blood ran cold. The rendering was crude, but the face was unmistakable. It was Alara. Underneath the drawing, the words screamed in stark black letters, "Wanted for theft and the murder of Thomas Croft. $500 reward. Signed, Baron Alistair Croft." $500. It was a fortune. Enough money to buy a real herd, to build a new life, to erase the ghosts of the past with the promise of a comfortable future. Any other man would have seen it as a sign from Providence. But Silas saw only the Baron's name, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his gut, that it was a lie. He had spent 10 years as a Texas Ranger, and he knew the smell of corruption. He had seen the truth in Alara's eyes, a quiet honesty that could not be faked. He looked at the poster, then back at the trail that led to the mountains, to the cabin where a woman was waiting, trusting him. The choice was not a choice at all. With a swift, angry motion, he tore the poster from the post, crumpling the lie in his fist. He turned his horse around and rode, not with the deliberation of a man running errands, but with the urgency of a man riding to defend his home. The ride back was a torment of wind and worry. The crumpled poster in his saddlebag felt like a stone, a physical weight of the danger that now had a name and a price. The sanctuary he had built, both the physical cabin and the fragile peace within his own soul, was under siege. He found Alara by the window watching the trail, her posture betraying an anxiety that mirrored his own. The relief that washed over her face when she saw him was a balm to his own frayed nerves, but it was short-lived. He couldn't hide the truth from her. Their shared silence had been broken, and it could not be rebuilt with a lie. That evening, after their meal, he placed the crumpled poster on the table between them. The paper unfurled slowly, as if reluctant to reveal its ugly message. Alara stared at it, the color draining from her face. The fear that returned to her eyes was a familiar ghost, the hunted look he had first seen in the storm. But this time, something was different. She did not crumble. She did not look away. She lifted her chin, her gaze meeting his, filled with a sorrowful defiance. The fortress of his heart ached for her. This was the moment she would run, he thought, back into the wilderness, believing him to be another threat, another man who might see the bounty and not the person. But she remained seated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. And then she began to speak. The words came out in a torrent, a story of quiet dignity violated by obsessive greed. She told him of her position as governess to the Baron's orphan nephew, Thomas. She spoke of the Baron's suffocating attention, his lavish gifts she refused, his proposals she politely declined. She described a man who could not comprehend the word no, a man for whom all the world was a collection of things to be acquired. When his nephew, a frail and kind-hearted boy who adored Alara, had fallen gravely ill, the Baron had seen his chance. After the boy's tragic death from fever, Croft had produced a forged confession, claiming Alara had poisoned the child after stealing the family jewels, all because she had spurned his advances. It was a monstrous, twisted lie, but the Baron's wealth and influence made it the official truth. She had fled, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small book of poetry the boy had given her. Silas listened, his expression unchanging, a mask of granite. But inside, a cold, righteous fury was building, a fire he had not felt in years. When she finished, a single tear traced a path down her cheek. She looked at him, her vulnerability absolute. "I understand if you want me to leave," she whispered. "I have brought this trouble to your door. He reached across the table, his calloused hand covering hers. It was the first time he had willingly touched her. His voice, when he spoke, was low and steady, a vow forged in the fire of his reawakened soul. "He won't find you here," Silas declared. "I won't let him." The Baron's name, once spoken, hung in the air between them, a constant, unspoken threat. Yet, paradoxically, the revelation of this shared danger did not drive them apart. It bound them together with cords of loyalty stronger than steel. The cabin was no longer just his shelter that he offered her. It was their sanctuary, a small island of defiance in a world that had wronged them both. The dynamic between them shifted profoundly. Silas began to train her, not to become a warrior, but to be a survivor. He took her out into the crisp mountain air and taught her how to handle a rifle, not just the mechanics of loading and firing, but the patience of aiming, the discipline of breathing. Her hands, once accustomed to the gentle weight of books, grew steady around the cool wood and steel. He was not a gentle teacher, he was methodical, demanding, imbuing her with the stark lessons of his past. But beneath the gruff instruction, she saw the truth. This was his way of caring for her, of arming her against the world, of giving her the agency she had been denied. In turn, Elara brought a different kind of strength to their partnership. She began to draw him out, asking him quiet questions about the faded photograph on his mantelpiece, the one he never looked at. Slowly, painfully, he told her of his wife and daughter, lost to a Comanche raid years ago, an attack that had happened while he was away on a ranger patrol. His solitude was not merely a preference, it was a penance. He had failed to protect his own family, so he had exiled himself from the world, believing he was unworthy of another. She listened, her heart breaking for the depth of his pain, and offered him not pity, but understanding. "You cannot guard the entire world, Silas," she told him one evening, her hand resting on his arm. "But you can build a new one." Their love story was written not in grand declarations, but in these quiet moments of shared vulnerability. It was in the way he started leaving a wildflower on the table for her in the mornings, and in the way she would read to him from her book of poetry by the firelight, her voice a gentle melody that soothed the ragged edges of his soul. They were forging a found family from the broken pieces of their lives. One afternoon, as a hawk circled in the vast blue sky above, Silas looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the fugitive he had rescued, but the resilient woman who was rescuing him. He saw a future he had long ago given up on. He had found a new purpose, a new family to protect, and this time he would not fail. The peace they had so carefully constructed was as fragile as a pane of frost on a winter morning. It was shattered by the distant, unnatural sound of approaching horses, a sound that did not belong in their secluded valley. Silas heard it first, his body instantly tensing, the old instincts of the ranger flaring to life. He moved to the window, his movements economical and swift, and peered down the trail. A knot of riders was making its way up the mountain pass, their dark forms stark against the snow. At their head rode a man on a magnificent black stallion, a man who carried himself with an air of insufferable arrogance. It was Baron Croft. He had come himself, a testament to the depth of his obsession. He had used his vast resources to bribe and track, to follow the faintest whispers until they led him to this remote cabin. He had not come for justice, he had come to collect his property. Silas turned from the window, his face a grim mask. "He's here," he said, the words falling like stones into the quiet room. Elara's hand flew to her throat, but the terror in her eyes was tempered by a new, hard resolve. This was not the desperate, fleeing woman from the storm. This was a woman who had learned to stand her ground. "Get the rifle," Silas said, his voice calm and deadly. He checked his own revolver, the familiar weight of it in his hand a cold comfort. The riders fanned out, surrounding the cabin in a loose, menacing circle. They were hired guns, men whose loyalty was bought and whose morality was non-existent. The Baron reined in his horse just beyond rifle range, his handsome face twisted into a sneer of triumph. "Elara, my dear," his voice boomed, slick and cloying, a violation of the clean mountain air. "Your little game of hide-and-seek is over. Come out, and I might be lenient. As for the squatter hiding you, he has made a grave error interfering in my affairs." Inside the cabin, Elara looked at Silas. She saw no fear in his eyes, only a fierce, protective fire. He was ready to die for her. And in that moment, she knew she was ready to do the same for him, for the life they had started to build, for this home that had been born from the ashes of their former lives. The external threat had arrived, and the final battle for their future was about to begin. The standoff was a battle of wills before it was a battle of bullets. From within the dark interior of the cabin, Silas was a ghost, a lethal presence Croft's men could feel but not see. He was no longer the grieving homesteader. He was the ranger, a man who understood angles, cover, and the fatal patience of a predator. He had positioned Alara at the small rear window, a spot with a clear field of fire, but maximum protection from the log walls. She held the rifle he had taught her to use, its stock pressed firmly against her shoulder. Her heart was a frantic drum, but her hands were steady. She was no longer a damsel in distress. She was a defender of her own life, a hero in her own right. "He will try to talk," Silas murmured, his voice low and steady beside her. "He thinks his power comes from his voice, his money. He's wrong." Croft, growing impatient, spurred his horse forward slightly. "I am a patient man, but my patience has its limits. Send out the woman, and I will let you live, peasant." The word peasant dripped with such contempt it was almost comical. Silas gave Alara a look, a flicker of a grim smile. It was a look that said, "This is the man you defied? He is nothing." That small gesture filled her with a courage that burned brighter than her fear. She had been terrified of this man's shadow for months, but here in the light he seemed smaller, his power nothing more than bluster and cruelty. The first shot did not come from the hired guns. It came from Silas. It was not aimed to kill, but to make a statement. The bullet whizzed past Croft's head, close enough to make him flinch violently, and shattered a branch just behind him. A gasp went through his men. This was not some frightened farmer. This was someone who knew how to fight. The confrontation erupted. Gunfire shattered the mountain silence, the sharp cracks echoing off the granite peaks. Smoke filled the air. But it was not the chaotic spray of panicked men. Silas was methodical, his shots precise, aimed to disable and disorient. He moved from the front window to a crack in the logs, a phantom they could not pin down. One of the hired guns, trying to flank the cabin, cried out as a bullet from Alara's rifle tore through the fleshy part of his thigh. It was her first time firing a weapon at another human being, and a wave of nausea washed over her, but she swallowed it down, her resolve hardening. She was protecting her home. She was protecting Silas. The climax came when Croft, enraged and humiliated, made a fatal error. Blinded by arrogance, he charged forward on his horse, revolver drawn, intending to end it himself. It was the move of a tyrant, not a tactician. Silas stepped into the open doorway, his own pistol leveled and steady. For a second, the two men locked eyes, the quiet honor of the protector against the possessive fury of the tyrant. It was over in a heartbeat. Silas fired once. Croft cried out, clutching his shoulder, and toppled from his magnificent horse into the undignified snow. His power, his entitlement, and his reign of terror ended not with a bang, but with a pathetic thud. His men, seeing their paymaster defeated, lost their nerve and fled, melting back down the mountain pass like the cowards they were. Silence descended once more, profound and complete. The sharp, acrid smell of gunpowder hung in the air, a stark contrast to the clean scent of pine. Silas stood in the doorway, a sentinel watching the last of Croft's men disappear. He was wounded, a shallow graze on his arm, but he seemed not to notice. Alara rushed to his side, her hands fluttering near his injury, her face a canvas of concern and relief. He simply looked at her, his winter sky eyes clear and filled with a deep, quiet pride. They had faced the storm together and had won. The law, when it was finally summoned from redemption, was slow to arrive but surprisingly just. With Baron Croft alive to stand trial, and with the evidence of his forgery and conspiracy provided by Alara's testimony and the captured hired guns, her name was officially cleared. The shadow that had haunted her for so long was finally banished, not by running, but by standing her ground. The epilogue of their story was not written in dramatic confrontations, but in the quiet, steady prose of everyday life. Spring arrived in the high country, and it was a season of breathtaking transformation. The snow melted, feeding rushing creeks and revealing a carpet of vibrant green. Wildflowers bloomed in defiant bursts of color across the meadows. The change was mirrored in the small cabin. It was no longer a fortress of grief, but a home. Laughter, a sound Silas had thought he would never hear again, became a frequent guest. Alara planted a garden, her hands, once soft and then calloused by the rifle, now gentle in the rich earth. Silas bought a small herd of cattle, his days filled with the meaningful work of a man building a future. They married under the watchful eyes of the ancient pines, the only witnesses they needed. His redemption was not a single act of heroism, but the daily choice to open his heart, to protect and to love. He had found his family, not by replacing the one he had lost, but by allowing a new one to grow. Alara's journey from a victim of circumstance to the master of her own fate was complete. She had discovered a strength she never knew she possessed, a resilience as profound as the mountains themselves. Their love was a quiet, powerful thing, a testament to the idea that even in the harshest wilderness, both of the land and of the heart, the most beautiful things can grow. And so, a story that began in the heart of a winter storm finds its peace in the warmth of a spring sun. It reminds us, doesn't it, that the deepest wounds are not always the most visible, and the greatest courage is often the quietest. Silas and Alara were two broken souls who, instead of allowing their pasts to define them, chose to build a future from the fragments. They teach us that a home is not four walls and a roof, but the safe harbor we find in another's heart. They show us that redemption is possible, that love can be a powerful force for healing, and that even when hope feels like a distant ember, the right person can help fan it back into a brilliant flame. What part of their journey resonated with you the most? Was it Alara's discovery of her own strength, or Silas's journey back from the depths of his grief? We create these stories to explore the great triumphs of the human spirit, and we would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Your reflections are what give these stories their continuing life. Thank you for joining us on this journey to the inspirational frontier, and if you found a spark of hope in their tale, be sure to like and subscribe for more stories of love, courage, and redemption.